Who is Jesus? Hello again, welcome to another video, and with that minuscule intro, we have left ourselves with a lot of ground to cover in this video because today I thought it'd be cool to talk about who Jesus is based on my current understanding of what I believe and why. And I begin with that kind of open-ended description of things because I think when we're talking about the nature of things related to God, related to the Son of God, I will try to be open-ended in the way that I present things. The reason I do that, the reason I'm a fan of doing that is that I like to think about the fact that we're talking about a God who is both infinite and eternal. And so when we try to come together in video form and try to wrap my little pea brain around the nature of God, I think it's a good thing to not start making sweeping presumptions that we have everything figured out. A verse that I like to keep in mind when we get into these types of discussions, sometimes I'll show it to people if I think maybe they're maybe a little bit too sure of themselves in terms of their confidence of their understanding of who God really is found in John chapter 6 here. This is the end of John chapter 6. And we see Peter here. We see Jesus talking to his disciples, but we see here Peter in verse 69 talks to Jesus, and he says to Jesus, "And we have already believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God." Peter here, not entirely out of character for what we read about Peter in the other Gospels, not entirely out of character. Peter gets a little bit ahead of himself, and he says to Jesus, "Don't worry, Jesus, we have got you figured out. We have come to know who you are. You're the Holy One of God. So you don't need to worry. We got you figured out." And in response, what does Jesus say? Verse 70, Jesus answered them, "Did I myself not choose you, the 12? And yet one of you is a devil?" And Jesus kind of puts Peter in check here. Jesus doesn't say, "Well, that's true, Peter. It certainly seems like you're doing well. Certainly seems like you've got all the major things figured out. Good for you. You're doing great." No, Jesus, as I said, puts him in check a little bit. Jesus says to him, "Peter, wait a second, Peter. Did you figure me out? Did you figure out who I am? And then you made a conscious choice on the basis of that knowledge, and you decided to come down here and follow me? Is that what happened? Or were you in a fishing boat and I came to you and I told you to follow me?" Which was it again? Which one of those two things happened? So yeah, we see Peter here getting a bit ahead of himself in terms of knowledge, basically making grandiose claims to have Jesus all figured out. And Jesus is like, "Well, settle down, Peter. You don't get too far into what you think that you know. That's not going to help you. That's actually going to get in your way." So I try, as we discuss Jesus, as we discuss the Son of God, as we discuss theology here, I try to remember that kind of appropriate humility as we begin to study these things, so that, as I said earlier, I'll share some things based on my current understanding, but this side of heaven, I won't ever pretend to you that I've got all this stuff all figured out. I think that is a bridge too far. Is probably several bridges too far to make the claim that we've got it all figured out. Now, this is obviously a big subject, thinking about who Jesus is, thinking about the nature of the Son of God. We have to start somewhere on this subject. So the first place that I thought would be good to talk about is to consider the Son of God, the eternal nature, and the temporal nature. Give my camera a shove there. And I want to start here because this is an issue that the early church particularly grappled with. Some people today in the church continue to grapple with. The question of the Son of God. Was the Son of God eternal? Was the Son of God always the Son of God? Or was he the Son in the sense that he was of the Father, right? Normally, I'll say in human terms, when we think about a son is of the Father, which means that the Father precedes the Son in some sense, and then later on, the Son becomes the Son. And so the first point, camera, come on, settle down. All right, sorry about that. Camera issues, technical issues, whatever. So we were talking about the Son of God. Son of God is eternal. And a good place to start looking at that in Scripture is if we run over here to John chapter 1. Let's go to the top here. So it's like that. That looks good. Okay, so John chapter 1, the very beginning of the chapter, very beginning of the gospel, reads, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God." So John quite clearly here is, in the opening of his gospel, he is alluding all the way back to the point of creation here. If we jump over and take a look at Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Very familiar verse. Many of us are aware of it from John chapter 1. This is the beginning of creation itself. And if we go back here to John chapter 1, very, very similar wording. In the beginning was the Word. So what is going on here quite clearly, quite deliberately, quite consciously in John chapter 1 is John is pointing back to the creation of all things. And remember, when we talk about the creation of all things, we're talking about the earth, of course, everything in it, but we're talking about the heavens. We're talking about even broader than that. We're talking about all things that are physical, all things that are temporal. Even time itself finds its beginning back in Genesis chapter 1, this point of creation. And John is saying here in John chapter 1 that all the way back at that point, we have the Word was God, and we have the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. Now, the other thing to note about this passage, which may be interesting and is easy to get lost in English, is that John is writing here in the imperfect tense. So what that means is that he isn't saying at the beginning of all things, at this point of creation, that the Son became one with the Father. The imperfect tense means that something happened at a specific point, but at an undefined point is what the imperfect tense suggests. So John isn't saying that in the beginning the Son became God, the Son became with God. What John is saying in the imperfect tense is at that point of creation, we find the Son already one with the Father. It was a pre existing relationship, and it pre existed all of creation, because this is what John is alluding back to, right? He's alluding back to the beginning. The beginning of what? The beginning of all things. All things that are created. And that actually is what John goes to in the very next verse, verse 3. All things came into being through him, and apart from him, not even one thing came into being that has come into being. So this eternal Son, this Son existent in this way before the creation of all things, not only was he not a product of creation, not only was he not a part of the creation, he pre-existed that creation, but also he was directly involved in the act of creation. He wasn't just not created, he was doing the creating. It says right here, all things came into being through him. And apart from him, not even one thing came into being that has come into being. So this is the Son that we're talking about in John chapter 1. And then if we scroll down a little bit here to verse 14 in the same chapter, verse 14 reads, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we saw his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." So while the Son of God is eternal, at a specific moment in time, and we know that moment took place about 2,000 years ago, at a specific point in time, at a specific point in human history, the Son became flesh, as John says, and he dwelt among us in the person of Jesus Christ. So this may be a technical distinction to make, but it's an important distinction nonetheless. We've looked at how the Son of God is eternal, but the person of Jesus Christ is not eternal, because the name Jesus refers to one who was born into humanity, right? The name Jesus is not found back in Genesis. The Son of God has existed eternally, and the Son of God put on flesh and was born as a baby 2,000 years ago, and that baby was named Jesus. Now, a couple things we can say about the incarnation. Some people will ask the question, I've had this conversation with people, they'll ask, well, I thought that God was unchanging. So how can, if Jesus is God, how can he be eternal, but then put on flesh and dwell among us, and yet be unchanging, right? That seems like a pretty big change. And Hebrews, this is, I think, Hebrews chapter 13, gives us a good verse here. Hebrews 13 and verse 8 reads, "Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever." So I think, legitimate question, how can this be true? How can he be infinite and eternal and then enter into time and space and yet be unchanging? And I think the answer is, when we affirm all of these verses as true, the question kind of answers itself in a way. I think the inevitable conclusion that we have to land upon is that for the Son of God, his metaphysical makeup, his metaphysical nature is not what makes him him. So his unchanging nature, by definition, is his love, his forgiveness, his mercy, his grace, his patience. But the stuff that he's made out of, or not made out of, that's not what makes him him. So he is throughout all of eternity. And at a specific point in creation, he puts on flesh and he dwells among us. But his change in physical form is not a change to who he is. He remains unchanging. He still is who he is. And I think maybe when we think about that can have some interesting perspectives on how we see ourselves as well, right? I think in a maybe more extreme sense, I think about these Hollywood movies where somebody goes off to war and they get horribly hurt, horribly injured, and they come back and they get rebuilt, reborn into this, cybernetic being. But we learn through the movie that they still are who they are on the inside, right? Maybe they can do really cool physical stuff now. Maybe they can run a 3-minute mile. Maybe they can punch holes through walls. All of these amazing things that they couldn't have done in their old body. But the core of them remains the same. I think there's a sense of that maybe in the understanding of these passages, that whether the Son is an infinite, eternal being, or whether he's a man walking the earth, he still is who he is. But I think maybe even outside of the Hollywood perception, there's something maybe even more relevant to us as individuals, which is, what about when we die? What about when we die and we enter into the heavenly realm? When we die and we enter into the heavenly realm, when we receive resurrected bodies of our own, I wonder if we will understand this concept better. I wonder if we'll experience this similar type of thing where we go through a radical change in our metaphysical makeup, in our structure, but we retain who we are in terms of our nature. We still are the same person at our core. And one more thing I will say on this point, we mentioned the struggle over this idea through the history of church, the idea of whether Jesus is, or I should say, whether the Son is infinite and eternal, or whether he became the Son at some point. And where I wanted to go with this next is to maybe explore a little bit about that struggle. Where does this struggle come from? Where does the confusion, where does the disagreement come from? I wanted to dig into that a little bit and explore it. And there's a few different Bible passages that people have cited to bring up this question of the eternal Son. The first one that we can talk about here is found in Matthew chapter 3. If we go there. Yeah, Matthew chapter 3 here. This is the baptism of Jesus, and in the middle of this baptism, we hear this voice from heaven, Matthew chapter 3, verse 17. A voice from the heavens said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." So the suggestion here in reading this passage, just to explain to you where people have taken these passages, the suggestion here is that this verse is affirming at the point of Jesus's baptism, Jesus becomes the Son of the Father. That's what people have said in regard to the scripture. And so what I would say in response, honestly, I think this is the weakest argument out of the ones that we're going to look at in this video. I think it's not a great argument, and the reason I think it's not a great argument is because I think it reads into the text something that the text really doesn't say. Let me explain what I mean. Jesus is getting baptized here in Matthew chapter 3. This voice from the heaven says, "This is my son." Well, that doesn't mean that this is the beginning of that relationship, right? Right? I visited my parents this past week and went over to their house. And if my dad had looked at me and said, "This is my son," well, that's a true statement, but it doesn't mean that I wasn't his son a month ago, right? It doesn't mean that at all. And so when we look at this passage in Matthew chapter 3 and this voice from heaven, it simply conveys what is true in the present tense. This is my beloved son. There's no sense of the beginning of a relationship here. That it's just not there in the text. And so it's not there, nor do I think it's a natural thing to read into the text. I just don't see that in the text. I don't see it as a natural interpretation of the text. I think it's reading a problem into the text that really isn't found there, right? The Father is simply saying, "This is my son." He isn't saying, "This has become my son," or "This has started to be my son." None of those things are there. Another passage that the church has grappled with over the years is found in Hebrews chapter 1. The beginning of the chapter here. Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 5. And the text reads, "You are my son. Today I have fathered you." Now, in contrast to the passage that we just looked at in Matthew 3, I think this one is a bit more of a challenge for us, because I think the potential issue when we consider an eternal son, the potential issue is a bit more clear and a bit more visible from the text. The issue being that God is saying, "You are my son," but he's saying, "Today I have fathered you." So the suggestion then is that the Father was not always the Father. The Son was not always the Son, right? Good. And so what I would say to this is, I think the response to this issue is, if we zoom out a bit and we look at Hebrews chapter 1 in a more broad sense, we can see that there are two concepts in view here in the chapter, and we've already talked about both of them. That is, we see in Hebrews chapter 1, we see the eternal Son present in this passage, right? Verse 2 reads, "Through whom he made the world." Clearly, if the Son made the world, if the Son participated in creation, as we read about in John chapter 1, then the Son can't be a part of that creation, because creation can't create creation, right? You can't create yourself. That's impossible. But then, so that's verse 2, but then as we move down into verse 6, says, "He brings the firstborn into the world. Let all the angels of God worship him." Sorry, that's off the screen here. Verse 6, "When he again brings the firstborn into the world," he says, "and let all the angels of God worship him." So this is a reference to the incarnate son, right? The son that was born into space and time. So we see both of these concepts that we've talked about here in Hebrews chapter 1. We see the eternal Son who always was, and we see the incarnate Son who was born. And so in verse 5, the text says, "Today I have fathered you." We would obviously say that this is a verse that's speaking of the incarnate Son, the Son that became flesh, to use John chapter 1 terms. And the last passage that I would like to look at here is found in the book of Colossians. Colossians chapter 1 and verse 15 reads, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation." So people will look at this verse and they will conclude, well, if the Son is the firstborn of all creation, then that means he was born of creation, right? He is a part of the creation. Camera's upset again. All right, camera just dropped off again. That zero stars for my camera for this video. Anyway, yes, so people would look at this passage from Colossians 1 and say, so Jesus was the firstborn of all creation, which means A, that he was born, and B, that he was a part of creation. How would we understand that passage? How would we respond to it? Well, the very first thing I would say is that if we're going to take this passage to mean born in a biological sense, in a chronological sense, then that interpretation really doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? Because if we're talking about who was born, if we're saying that Jesus is the firstborn of all creation in the sense of a physical birth, well, Jesus wasn't the firstborn of creation by any stretch of the imagination, right? The first man who existed in creation was Adam. Well, you could make the argument, well, Adam was created, so technically he wasn't born. Okay, so we could say that, Cain and Abel and later Seth, they were some of the firstborn men of creation. But even beyond Cain and Abel and Seth, later on came Noah, and later on still came Abraham, and later on still came Jacob, and then Moses, and then all of the Old Testament prophets. Thousands and thousands of years of history, generation upon generation upon generation, until in first century Israel, Jesus was born. So again, if we're going to say that Colossians 1 is referring to physical, biological, chronological birth, we would have to figure out how to make sense of this verse, because in that sense, Jesus quite clearly was not the firstborn of all creation, right? Not even remotely close. So here's what I think is going on in this passage. I don't think that Colossians chapter 1 is talking about biology or chronology at all. The reference to the term firstborn is a word that comes out of Jewish culture, and in Jewish culture, the firstborn son was seen as preeminent over the family. So this passage in Colossians is not talking about biological birth or chronological birth. When it calls Jesus the firstborn of all creation, it isn't saying that he was the first one to be born. It's saying that he was preeminent over creation. It's a passage that's talking about his supremacy over creation, his sovereignty over creation, his authority over all creation. And when we think about the passage in those terms, it aligns perfectly with the passages that we've already looked at, like in Hebrews chapter 1, in John chapter 1. So we've talked here about the eternality of the Son of God. We've talked about the incarnate nature of Jesus Christ, the Word become flesh. So I think that's a good place to start here with our explanation or exploration of who Jesus is, who the Son of God really is. I think we'll leave it here for this video, but I want to keep exploring on this topic. I want to keep looking at different perspectives on who Jesus is. I'll probably make a video that discusses his power, his authority, as we've just been talking about a little bit. I'd like to make a video that discusses his relationship to the Father and how that works. So there's lots more to talk about here. But thank you for watching this video. Thank you for putting up with all of my camera glitches here. If you like the video, feel free to click like, feel free to click subscribe, feel free to leave a comment if you would like to talk about this some more. I'd be happy to get back to you and discuss further. But for now, thank you so much for watching. Hope you're having a good week, and God bless you.